So here we are in the fourth Sunday of the Easter season, and we're going to be looking at the Good Shepherd narrative in the Gospel according to St. John, and it'll help if you've had a look at that beforehand. As we go deeper into the Easter season, so we shift from what did the resurrection appearances mean to what does resurrection life actually look like. We have said before that in John's Gospel, each of the signs that Jesus does, which includes a saying of, I am something, I am the true vine, I am the light of the world, I am the bread of life. Each of these is an unveiling of the new creation which John announces at the beginning of his Gospel when he begins portentously, in the beginning was the Word. And this story of John about Jesus being a good shepherd casts a shadow on what resurrection life means, because it introduces the idea very explicitly that for John's community, the church, there are predators. There are those who do not wish them well. Why would John's community, and by extension the church, have predators? This runs counter to a lot of the sensibilities we had growing up with church. If you grew up in the 50s or 60s, church was respectable. Church is what nice people do. All we need to know about faith is the golden rule. Do to others as you would want them to do to you. In other words, be nice to each other. Why on earth would that attract a sabotage? If you read John's Gospel as a whole, it'll become apparent very quickly that the unveiling of God's new creation in Jesus is not without problems. In fact, we are warned right from the very beginning that this new creation will encounter pushback right from the outset. Remember the opening words of John's Gospel. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God. That's a few verses into John's Gospel. And we see how as the Gospel unfolds, there is a very definite sense that Jesus, and by extension God's new creation, is not universally welcomed warmly. At one point, when Jesus heals a man born blind, Jesus instructs him to wash in a pool which restores his sight. When the local religious authorities learn of this, they cannot believe that a man born blind, healed through divine power, could have been healed by a man outside of their own religious group. After all, they were the gatekeepers to God. And John milks the humour of it, involving the man's parents, to make the religious authorities look even more outrageous, even more ridiculous. However, the shadow cast by today's reading about bandits from outside of the sheepfold tells us that the pushback to Jesus can be sinister and even dangerous, as indeed it turned out to be for Jesus himself. So clearly there is a lot more going on about being part of the community of Jesus than simply being respectable and being nice to each other. We begin to see that it's part of the church's vocation to be something that people from some quarters will want to sabotage. So back to our gospel reading. Thieves and bandits who try to take control of the flock from the rightful shepherd. What marks the true shepherd is the close relationship he has with the sheep. We are told they recognize his voice. So this leads me to ask three questions. What is it about the flock which makes it liable to predators? We've seen in the first three Gospels that the mission of Jesus is to establish the rule of God, called the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. The rule of God is distinguished by its disregard of the marks of status that people are prone to give and to assume and to defer to. It is open to all, regardless of their status in human society. We see people with diseases of poverty, women, children, even employees of the occupying forces receiving invitations to be included in this kingdom. The benefits of the kingdom are inclusion, sharing food, healing, and wholeness. So where would the opposition come to this? Who are the bandits who are moving in on the sheepfold? Reading the Gospels, you can see that it's those whose precious status is not accorded the respect that they think is due. Those who need to have out-groups, people who are regarded as inferior in the community. Those who fail to see that people they regard as impure are a mirror image of deep impurity within themselves, which they like to project out onto others, which they need to project out to others, lest they start looking inward. And those who see themselves, as I've said before, as gatekeepers to the things of God. Yes, bandits in the sheepfold can be bandits in the name of God as well. The opposition to Jesus is about defending human interests, human status, and even rocking the Roman imperial boat. The opposition to the kingdom of God, to the status quo, is no more vividly seen than in the triumphal entry of Jesus on what we call Palm Sunday, parodying the imperial procession of Pilate ahead of Passover. The sheepfold of Jesus, simply by belonging to Jesus, will be liable to sabotage and to plunder. So the second question, how does the flock stay safe? How does it stay true to its identity? Our reading assures us that nothing ultimately bad can happen to the flock, even though damage might happen to it in the medium term, as long as it makes it a priority to discern the voice of the Good Shepherd. To listen to the voice of that shepherd, we have to identify the things which can get in the way. That 1950s view of church, which I mentioned earlier, that says church is about social respectability and being nice, is something which sounds authentic enough. It's plausible, until we realize that the status of respectability was never on Jesus' agenda. What appears to be reasonable can very quickly become a barrier which we are trapped within, one which we need to break out of because it might circumscribe things we need to do in response to the call of the Good Shepherd. You simply have to ask the many changes in the temple whether Jesus was being nice or whether he was being respectable. So listening for the voice of the shepherd means being attentive to what was important to him, who was important to him, being attentive to what difference his presence made in places where he ministered, and who were the people whose lives were transformed through contact with him. And while we're doing that, it's always good to notice those for whom he was a threat. If we're wanting to be attentive to bandits in the sheepfold, then those who were threatened by Jesus are a very good place to start to look, particularly since their descendants are with us to this very day. The flock ensures its integrity by listening to Jesus, and listening to Jesus above all else. Finally, how do we discern the shepherd's voice from bandits and thieves? A clue to this is being given in our gospel reading today. John tells us, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." So what deals life and what deals death? A church should always be orientated to what in the Gospel of John is called abundant life. Remember John's first sign of Jesus and the new creation at the wedding in Cana. The stone water jars, whose function was to make people worthy, their purpose was for rites of purification. These are subverted to becoming vessels for that celebration of abundant life which a wedding represents. Here is a key to how we organize ourselves as a flock that attends to Jesus' voice. There's no point in building walls around ourselves about purity or about anything else, or doctrinal fences, or even allowing ourselves to be influenced by our sense of who is pure and acceptable and who isn't. If we do this, then we run the danger of becoming like the people who resisted Jesus. We start risking making ourselves God's gatekeepers, and that's not our job. And we know how Jesus responded to those who behaved as if they were God's gatekeepers. It's a much better way to organize church to make the Good Shepherd the center of what we do, the place that we're always checking back to when we make our decisions about what our calling is, what our direction is, how we use our resources. If we keep Jesus firmly in the center, we can afford to leave the edges fuzzy. In fact, it's a sign of a healthy church that we can leave the edges fuzzy. Because in both Norton and in Evesham, we have gatherings of people whose journeys have been very diverse, people who see the life of the Spirit in very different ways. They all belong, and we enjoy the diversity that we do because we keep the edges fuzzy and keep Jesus at the center. And as long as we're centered on Jesus, we can afford things to be allowed to be a bit scruffy at the edges, just in the same way that Jesus did.